On August 1, 2010, a 000 call was made from Mount Druitt in Western Sydney. A young girl had gone missing. Her mother had put her to bed the night before, and by morning she had disappeared. The caller was Christy Abrahams, the mother of the missing child, Kisha. As police arrived at the scene, they understood the urgency, knowing that the first few hours of a child being reported missing are crucial. They needed to speak to as many people as they could to establish a timeline of Kisha's last known movements and follow any possible leads. Christy was no longer in a relationship with Kisha's biological father, Chris Whippert, so officers went to speak with him. Around 10:45 that morning, they interviewed Chris, who stated he had been at home with his mother before leaving to get a tattoo. Christy's best friend and neighbor, Allison Anderson, was eager to help, so she asked Christy if she had any suspects in mind. Allison later recalled that Christy had referred to Whippert as the effing so-and-so and mentioned that he had ridden past the unit a week earlier and made a gun gesture with his fingers at Rob, who was hanging up the washing. Christy told Allison she needed to inform the police, but she refused. Rob, Christy's partner, had been out searching for Kisha since the moment they realized she was missing. In an attempt to generate leads and possibly locate Kisha if she had simply wandered off, a large-scale search was launched by police and volunteers. They combed through bushland, parks, and reserves, hoping to find the missing girl. The fast-moving operation continued to gain momentum, and Strike Force Yarisun was formed. The police discovered that Kisha hadn't been to school or been seen by anyone else since early July. The officer in charge, Detective Inspector Russell Oxford, said the last time she had been seen by immediate family was around 7th of that month. She had been reported missing on the August 1st. The 3 weeks in between were vital in putting together a timeline of events. 2 days after the call to emergency services was made, Christy and Robert made appeals for any news of her whereabouts and for anyone with information to come forward. Those in the community were desperate to find Aisha and bring her home. Candle-lit vigils were held and flowers and toys were laid out for the missing child. On the August 30th, it was reported that Kisha's father, Chris, was being questioned by the police. He was adamant that although he had been paying child maintenance, he hadn't seen Aisha in years and had not had regular contact with her since he and Christy had separated. He was adamant he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Police said that they had received new information that he had allegedly been seen near the Woodstock Avenue block on the morning she went missing. Chris had been in hospital for the previous 3 weeks after complications from diabetes meant he had to have major foot surgery. His mother, Liz, said, "I'm furious." She said that her son had not been kept up to date with the information about Kisha's case. "It has been 28 days. We have no idea what is going on. The police tell us nothing. Then they show up here saying this." But there was something that was standing out to the police. What had initially appeared as a desperate mother and stepfather awaiting any news soon began to raise eyebrows. The behavior of Christian Robert stood out to many as unusual. Neither of them had made any effort to join in the searches, and despite the fact her daughter was missing, life for Christy seemed to resume as normal. She would go and get her hair and nails done and go shopping. Her appearances in the media only aroused more suspicion. The pair were adamant that they were innocent, and their friend and neighbor, Allison Anderson, became the spokeswoman for them and would defend them against the rumors that had began to swell. Allison gave a statement on their behalf saying, "The family wished to deny the recent allegations in the media. The family encouraged the public to come forward with any information that may assist police to find Kisha. But please stop making baseless allegations. The family wished to be left alone to deal with the situation. You put yourself in their shoes. You couldn't imagine. And that's why this is the time when they need their friends and support and family." There was soon more controversy surrounding Kisha's case. As the investigation continued to be carried out, Rob and Christy moved into a local motel. Allison agreed to help them move to their new property in Kings Langley. When they went into the unit, one of Keisha's jumpers was lying on the floor. Christy said that the police had told her that there would be nothing belonging to Keisha there before she kicked the jumper away and began swearing. When Allison went into Keisha's room, there was nothing there, no possessions or toys. A forensics team descended on the unit they had lived in with Kisha. something disturbing was revealed. Blood belonging to the missing child was found in every room. Christy Abrahams was brought in for an interview. Over the following weeks, months, the community continued to hold on to the hope that she was still alive. But this would soon come crashing down. April 22, 2011, a huge announcement was made. 2 people had been taken into custody on suspicion of the murder of Kisha. None other than Christy Abrahams and Robert Smith. This arrest was the culmination of months of an intricate and complex undercover operation. An undercover officer would get close to Christy in the hope she would reveal what had happened to Kisha. At a motel, the undercover officer met with her, and in order to win Christy's trust, the officer told her he needed to know the truth and that he could help her move the body. Christy Abrams would finally confess. She said that Kisha had been refusing to put her pajamas on, and in response, Christy gave her what she called a nudge with her foot. This resulted in Kisha falling and hitting her head against the bed. She said Kisha's body was like jelly, but said that she did respond when Christy had asked her to squeeze her finger. She said, "And then she went funny, and then I put her in the shower to try and wake her up. She just started making weird noises. We thought it would go away. We really did." She stated that when she had checked on her the next morning, she wasn't breathing, but she didn't get her medical help. When describing how they had disposed of her body, she said, "He put petrol on her and branches on her." Smith and Abrahams then took the undercover officer to the deposition site. It was here that the search for Kisha came to a devastating end. Her little body was found in bushland, near Shelby, in Sydney's west. At 1:12 a.m., Abrahams and Smith were both arrested in a laneway near their home. They were then charged. For those officers who had been watching the couple for months, it was a bitter end to a tragic case. A candlelit vigil had been planned for Kisha's birthday, and hundreds turned up to pay their respects, many voicing their anger and disgust at how things had panned out. One card read, "Happy birthday, Kisha. You deserved a better life here in your time on Earth." At 2 o'clock on Good Friday, police informed Kisha's grandmother, Liz, that Abrahams and Smith had been arrested. This devastating news sent shockwaves throughout Kisha's family and the local community. The little girl they had helped look for, prayed for, and kept in their hearts was gone. In September 2011, Kisha's private funeral was held. Before the funeral, Chris said, "I want Kisha to leave this earth knowing how much she was loved, and I want her put to rest the way she deserves." They also requested that mourners wear Kisha's favorite color, purple. Abrahams and Smith had both put in requests to be able to attend the funeral, but Chris said hell would freeze over before he would let that happen, adding, "My family are the ones left to deal with all of this and arrange the best send-off for Kisha that she deserves. And I'm telling you, they are not coming." Their requests to attend were denied. On September 28, 2011, a public memorial was held for Kisha. Many questions needed to be answered, one of them being, how had this tragedy unfolded? When the truth was revealed, it would leave people outraged. Christy's early life had been marred by domestic violence. She had both witnessed and been subjected to violence at the hands of her father. Her mother had epilepsy, and when she was 10 years old, she heard her mother having a seizure. She was alone with her little brother who was just 3 years old. When she went to help her mother, she had tragically died from the seizure. Her father didn't want custody of his children. So, following this, she and her younger brother were put into foster care and spent time in various group homes. As a young teenager, she was examined by a psychologist who determined that due to an intellectual disability, she needed to be with an appropriate family who could provide her with the correct emotional support, and by the age of 16, she was in a girls' refuge. When she was 19 years old, she met Chris Whippert through his brother Matthew, and a romantic relationship quickly formed. Not long after, Christy was pregnant. Soon into her pregnancy, Chris had found Christy punching her stomach following an argument between the pair. Things seemed to simmer down for a while and the pregnancy continued. On the February 6, 2003, she gave birth to their son, Aiden. Community services officers visited the house and found nothing seemingly untoward with Aiden apart from Christy giving him 1 scoop of formula instead of 2. After another fight between the pair, the police were called. Chris said, "I'm Aiden's dad. His mom's not coping and she mixes her medication. She threw my clothes and stereo off the balcony last night and threw a lit candle at me while she had Aiden in her arms. The wax went everywhere and nearly burnt him. She's up all night with Aiden and has threatened to throw him off the balcony if he doesn't shut up and let her sleep. I don't know what to do. Christy refused to open the door to the officer, but after talking to a community services worker, the officer believed that Aiden would be removed that night. But this didn't happen. Just 6 weeks later, tragedy would strike. March 22, 2003. Chris's mother Liz saw her son arriving at the house on his bike. The news he had was horrifying. He told her, "Aiden's blue and he's dead and he's cold." Christy's up there screaming and screaming, "Mom, I found him and he was on his face." Liz went straight to the unit and found Christy holding Aiden, screaming that he was cold and to get another blanket. He was taken to hospital, but there was nothing that could be done. Little Aiden had died. The post-mortem found no signs of abuse and his cause of death was unascertained. Just over 1 year later, Christy gave birth to their second child in April 2004, a little girl, Kisha. The pair began arguing again. She told Chris that it was over and he needed to leave for good. As he packed his things, Christy followed him and they carried on rowing. Kisha was just 15 months old at the time and started crawling towards the couple. Chris said Christy stormed towards Kisha and picked her up by the neck before carrying her through to the living room and dumping her on the sofa. Kisha began to crawl off again. Christy responded by picking her up and biting her on the shoulder, leaving Kisha screaming in pain. Chris immediately called the police. Kisha was taken to the hospital and Christy would be convicted and given a 12-month good behavior bond. Chris was originally given custody of Kisha. However, the Department of Community Services, now the Department of Family and Community Services, put Kisha into foster care. On October 15, 2006, Christy was arrested for having outstanding warrants for driving without a license. Just 2 months later, and after taking part in anger management counseling, Kisha was returned to her. A year later, Christy was pregnant again with a second daughter. During a hospital visit, a nurse saw a bruise on Kisha's face and reported it. A caseworker spoke with Kisha the following day, and Kisha could not explain how it had happened. There was also a cigarette burn on her body, and she said, "Mom hit there. Mom did that," but no further action was taken. Kisha lived in such a state of fear. Her mother raising her arm in conversation would cause her to flinch. At this point, Christy was in a new relationship with a man called Robert Smith. By June 2010, Christy was pregnant for a 4th time. Christy called her father, someone at the center of much of her unhappiness, and asked him to take Aisha. She told him, "I'm sick of her. I will hurt her. I really will hurt her. I will kill her." Liz, Chris's mother, didn't even know Kisha was back living with Christy until the police arrived at her house saying the little girl was missing and they needed to search the property. Over the course of her life, several reports had been made by family members and neighbors regarding injuries on Kisha. Education officials also made various trips to the home as Kisha had only been to school 4 times in her whole life. And when she had gone, teachers had reported seeing bruises on her head and face. Between January-July 2010, truant officers made 7 trips to the home. But each time, the door was locked and they got no answer. They then informed Christy that they would be taking legal action against her regarding Kisha's school attendance. Allison said the last time she had seen her was on July 11th at around 4:30 in the afternoon. Kisha was in the car, and Christy was stood outside smoking. Allison would later say, Kisha asked if she could hop out of the car. Christy said, "No, you effing can't. Shut up and sit in the car." That was the last time I heard or saw Kisha. As the initial investigation began, the behavior of Abrahams and Smith stood out. When looking back at the press appeals, Liz, Chris's mother, said, "A lot of flashbacks come into your head. I'd seen it before with Aiden. That's why I knew something was going on. It wasn't tears when Kisha was missing. I'd seen it before. There was no inquest held into Aiden's death. But after Kisha was killed, a senior official said there probably should have been one." And following their arrests, Detective Inspector Russell Oxford said they would consider reopening the investigation into Aiden's death. Abrahams and Smith then went about attempting to destroy any evidence they thought could link them to Kisha's death. They took things out of the property and threw away shoes and clothes, along with the SIM cards from their phones. In order to maintain the image that Kisha was loved and cared for, and that they hoped she was still alive, they went out and brought children's toys and a Tinkerbell poster for when she came home. Forensic pathologist Dr. Matthew Ord had carried out the examination of Kisha's remains. She had fractures to her teeth and 10 different injuries to her body and head. Her jawbone had been broken in 2 places. Dr. Ord said, "These types of injuries are mainly found in children who have suffered severe, prolonged physical abuse," adding they would have left her in considerable pain. Following her death, her mother and stepfather kept her little body in a suitcase. After several days, they burned her body and buried her in a shallow grave. They threw away the hammer used to dig the grave and also burned the suitcase her body had been kept in. After this, they got a taxi home. In late November 2012, more tragedy would strike. Chris, Kisha's father, passed away suddenly. He was found by his mother, and he had been suffering from various health issues including diabetes and had also been battling substance abuse. He went to bed and then didn't wake up. Before court proceedings began, Allison Anderson went to see Abrahams in prison. She asked her former friend why she had lied throughout the investigation and left people wondering for months where Kisha was. The first thing for Christy to say to her former friend was, "Have you seen Robs? What are you doing here?" Allison asked why Christy had used her and lied to her, and why if she was struggling to cope. She hadn't given Kisha to a family member or her to look after. Allison then shouted at her, "You rot in jail, you filthy pig kid killer." She then took her shirt off to reveal a purple shirt with a voice for Kisha written on it, something she would later wear throughout the trial. Allison said the only response from Abrahams was, "Use rot in hell." Abrahams also blew a kiss at her. The prison guards had to pull Allison away, and she was subsequently banned from going back to the prison for life. She decided against visiting Robert Smith, saying it wouldn't achieve anything or give people the answers they needed. July 18, 2013. As the police van pulled up at the Sydney Supreme Court, there were angry reactions from members of the public, with people chasing the van and shouting. The courtroom was packed. Abrahams turned her back on the public gallery and looked only in the direction of the judge. On the first day of her trial, Christy Abrahams entered a plea of guilty to the murder of her daughter after the Crown had previously rejected her plea of manslaughter. Christy Abrahams was sentenced to serve at least 16 years, with a maximum of 22.5 years, in prison for murder and interfering with a corpse. As her sentence was handed down by Justice Ian Harrison, she showed no reaction. Cries from the public gallery could be heard. Justice Harrison said, "The trust placed between a parent and child is of the highest and utmost importance." Abrahams caused the death of Kisha with the infliction of a violent, lethal force on what was a vulnerable and defenseless child in her care who was entitled to expect and receive her attention. Justice Harrison found that while she hadn't intended to take Aisha's life, she had meant to cause grievous bodily harm. He also said that he could not be sure beyond a reasonable doubt who was responsible for the other injuries that Aisha had sustained prior to her death. He rejected her account of what had happened, but said that the evidence could not adequately explain exactly what had happened. He noted that Christy Abrahams had been abused as a child, and said that what had happened to Kisha was the inevitable product of entire intergenerational failures, adding, "The death of the deceased is the foreseeable and predictable consequence of preventable cyclic abuse. The offender's failures are mirrored in the failures of others." Justice Harrison did find beyond a reasonable doubt that she had recklessly failed to look after Kisha after she had become injured, which amounted to reckless indifference to human life. Robert Smith was tried separately. On the May 3, 2013, he was sentenced to a minimum of 12 years for manslaughter and being an accessory to murder. Christy Abrahams will be eligible for parole in 2027. For her former friend, Allison Anderson, the sentence wasn't good enough. She said, "It's just horrifying knowing she can be out when she's 46. Does having a bad upbringing and abuse give you the right to go and take people's lives? She knew what she was doing. It's just a cop-out." Kisha was killed by a cold-blooded murderer. The knock-on effect of Kisha's case was huge. So many people had been betrayed, lied to, and left broken. They hoped that they would be able to bring Kisha home and put all of their efforts into making this happen. One person who was particularly affected was Allison Anderson. While she had had her own concerns from the beginning of the investigation, she had desperately wanted to believe that her friend had had nothing to do with whatever had happened to Kisha. Now faced with the realization that she had been lied to the entire time, it was an incredibly painful and devastating thing to come to terms with. Allison had also been in foster care as a child and experienced abuse, meaning that this was incredibly personal to her. She would later go on to become a qualified youth worker and use her skills to help those who were vulnerable and in need so more children don't fall through the cracks. Childhood should be a time of innocence, wonder, and joy, but for little Kisha Whippet, it was a time of torment, fear, and pain. She should have been able to grow up in a happy and safe environment, free from abuse and free to flourish and grow. Those who loved her are determined that she will never ever be forgotten and that she will always be loved. Kisha's headstone reads, "You are not just a memory or part of our past. You're part of our family as long as it lasts." Deborah Core was a patrol woman with the Aurora Police Department in Colorado. At 26 years old, she had been with the department for a year. On June 27, 1981, Officer Core stopped a vehicle at East Colfax Avenue and Moline Street after observing the driver commit a traffic violation. As she began her interaction with the driver, 19-year-old Glenn Spies, who was driving home from his shift with Aurora's Police Explorers program, pulled up behind her patrol car. The program provided young people with experience in law enforcement, helping them decide if they wanted to pursue a career in the field. At the start of each shift, Glenn would pick up a police radio from the station and perform simple patrol tasks, such as checking for graffiti and watching over local parks and pools. As Glenn exited his vehicle, Officer Core was attempting to arrest the driver, who was resisting arrest. She had managed to handcuff one of his wrists, but the suspect managed to wrest control of her service weapon. Glenn heard Officer Core scream for help before the driver shot her with her own gun. Upon hearing the gunshot, Glenn attempted to hide behind the patrol car, but the shooter was able to hit him as well. The bullet struck near his spine, shattering upon impact. The assailant then fled the scene in his vehicle. Unable to move because of his injury, Glenn couldn't seek help or reach Officer Core. He was quickly rushed to the hospital. Despite initial concerns, he did not lose his ability to walk. His injury did prevent him from continuing into law enforcement, however, as it left him in a great deal of pain and made walking difficult. Officer Core did not survive her injuries. That day, she became the first Aurora police officer to be killed in the line of duty. Her killer was quickly identified as 30-year-old Joe Michael Irvin. Irvin was originally from North Texas. He had come to Colorado in 1969 to escape prosecution for another murder. In October of that year, a grand jury in Tarrant County indicted him for a murder, which had occurred at a bowling alley in Fort Worth 2 months earlier. The victim in that crime was 21-year-old Rodney Gene Bonham. During his time in Colorado, Irvin was suspected in several rapes and murders and was arrested but allowed out on bond in connection to 2 different cases. He was never connected back to the indictment in Texas because his year of birth had been incorrectly entered into the system when the arrest warrant was issued, and he had been living under the surname of Irving while in Colorado. Because these issues had not yet been uncovered, he was never extradited to Texas. When Irvin was arrested at his residence for Officer Core's murder, he was in the process of attempting to saw her hand cuff off of his wrist. Unfortunately, Irvin was never brought to justice for Officer Core's murder. On July 1, 1981, just a few days after his arrest, while he was being held in the Adams County Detention Center, he took his own life. More than 4 decades later, authorities would learn that Officer Core had not been Irvin's first victim in Colorado. She had been his last. On January 28, 2022, authorities announced that they were closing 4 cold cases they were now attributing to Irvin. DNA had tied him to the 4 murders, 3 in Denver and 1 in Adams County, that occurred between December of 1978 and January of 1981. While exact details have not been made public, Denver Police Commander Matt Clark did disclose that all of the cases had an underlying sexual component. 33-year-old Madeleine Fury-Livedet was killed on December 7, 1978. She was stabbed to death inside of her home on Poplar Street in Denver. Investigators believe Irvin came to her door and forced his way inside to kill her when she opened it. Madeleine was the mother of 2 young daughters. According to her sisters, Madeleine was creative and adventurous. She loved learning and traveling, but nothing as much as she loved her 2 girls. She was an ecologist, writer, and editor for the children's magazine Ranger Rick. Tragically, we didn't get to grow up with her and hear the stories and witness the contributions she would have made to the world. Madeleine's daughter, Molly, said after her mother's killer was finally identified. The body of Irvin's next victim, 53-year-old Dolores Barajas, was discovered on August 10, 1980, lying in the street in the 500 block of East 17th Avenue in Denver. She had been stabbed to death while walking to work at the Fairmont Hotel in downtown Denver, where she was employed in the cafeteria. Dolores had been working in Denver temporarily while spending the summer with relatives in Colorado and was about to return home to her family in El Paso, Texas. The day of her murder was her last day of work at the hotel before she traveled back to Texas. Dolores' family said in a statement read at the announcement of Irvin's identification that they still miss her greatly, and they are grateful for all of the efforts that ultimately resulted in her case being solved. They have requested that police not release any photos of her. The body of Gwendolyn Harris, 27, was found lying in the street near East 47th Avenue and Andrews Drive in Denver's Montbello neighborhood on December 21, 1980. She had been stabbed to death. The night before, she had been seen at the Polo Club Lounge in downtown Denver, somewhere she was known to frequent. The location where her body was found was more than 10 miles away from where she was last seen and within 1 block of Irvin's home at the time. According to her family, Gwendolyn was bright, soft-spoken, and athletic. Irvin's youngest victim was 17-year-old Antoinette Tony Parks. Sheriff's deputies in Adams County found her body in a field near 64th Avenue and Broadway on January 24, 1981. She had been stabbed 23 times. At the time of her murder, Tony was 6 to 7 months pregnant. She was a good student at Gateway High School and was determined to finish her high school education after she gave birth. She loved children, and the children in her family loved spending time with her. Her family believes she would have one day owned and operated her own daycare center. The 4 cases were originally investigated separately. However, between 2013 and 2018, they were all connected as a result of DNA evidence from the crime scenes. Dolores and Madeleine's cases were linked thanks to DNA in June of 2013, and DNA found during an examination of the evidence in Gwendolyn's case linked her murder to those 2 cases in December of 2015. DNA then tied Tony's murder in Adams County to the 3 Denver murders in October of 2018. In 2019, the investigative team began an in-house effort to use genetic genealogy to identify the individual whose DNA was found at the 4 crime scenes. This eventually narrowed their focus to the state of Texas, where the killer appeared to have extended family. Investigators in Colorado worked with their counterparts in Texas to perform familial searches in the Texas criminal database. This led to the identification of a more direct relative of the killer in 2021. By looking at this individual's family tree, authorities then identified Joe Michael Irvin as a potential suspect who required further investigation. No archived samples of Irvin's DNA could be located. Following his death in Colorado in 1981, Irvin's body was returned to his home state, and he was buried in Arlington, Texas. In late 2021, his remains were exhumed so that a DNA sample could be collected from them. In January of 2022, a direct comparison confirmed that it was Irvin's DNA found at all 4 crime scenes. Irvin's identification was highly emotional for the families of his victims. By the time Irvin was identified, Tony Park's mother and 3 sisters had all passed away without ever learning the identity of Tony's killer. Only Tony's 2 brothers, George and Carl Journey, lived long enough to learn who had taken Tony from them. George told Denver 7 News that he spent 3 hours crying after learning his sister's case was finally closed. He still loves and misses his sister, and while he is grateful for answers and all of the hard work that went into finding them, he still struggles with Tony's death. In addition, he also struggles with the fact that Irvin cannot be prosecuted for Tony's murder. "I'm angered because he didn't face justice," he told KCNC-TV. "But I know my mom and family wouldn't want us angry. They'd want us to be happy that this has all brought to a close." His brother, Carl, lives in Arkansas, and the family was concerned about finding the funds to fly him back to Colorado so that he and George could process the news together. Denver 7 News was able to provide the money for the flight through community donations to their Denver 7 Gives program, allowing both George and Carl to attend and speak at the press conference announcing Irvin's identification. Madeline Fury-Livedette's two daughters, Molly and Ariel, were also at the press conference, where Molly read a statement. In addition to recalling their mother's memory and accomplishments, they also thanked the investigators who had finally identified her killer. They also recognized Officer Deborah Core and the lives she saved with her death. With her sacrifice, she prevented him from killing anyone else, and it's clear that he wasn't going to stop on his own. She stopped him. The police stopped him back in 1981, and for that, for Officer Core's sacrifice of her life, we are grateful, Molly said in her statement. While Irvin cannot be prosecuted for the murders, authorities believe the years of effort that ultimately led to his identification were still beneficial. While the perpetrator cannot be fully held accountable for his despicable actions, we hope that knowing who is responsible can bring some peace to the families, Denver Police Chief Paul Pazin said at the press conference. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. In November of 2021, both the Harrisonburg Police Department and the Charlottesville Police Department were investigating missing persons cases in Virginia. In Charlottesville, authorities were searching for 39-year-old Nita Smith, a mother of 6 young children. She was last seen on the evening of November 14th and reported missing on November 19th. Police believed she may have traveled to Harrisonburg, Virginia, located more than 50 miles away in Rockingham County. Meanwhile, in Harrisonburg, police were also searching for 54-year-old Aileen Elizabeth Beth Redmond. Beth, a mother of 2 daughters and a grandmother of 4, had suffered the loss of her husband in 2017, which left her heartbroken. For years later, she was starting to rebuild her life, having secured a new job and an apartment to escape the painful memories of her late husband. Beth had not been seen since October 24th. Her family could not contact her and she did not come home to her apartment. She also failed to report to work, which was highly unusual for her. She did not have access to a vehicle, limiting her ability to travel on her own. The last time her family talked to her, she told them she was going to the Howard Johnson Hotel on Linda Lane to watch a football game with someone named Aunt. No one in her family had heard her talk about someone with that name before. The unrelated investigations into Nita and Beth's disappearances came together in Harrisonburg on November 23, 2021, when the bodies of both women were found near each other in an undeveloped lot in a commercial area off of Linda Lane. The 2 women had both been murdered, but at different times. I knew that I had to lose my mom one day, but never did I ever imagine that I would be in a way like this. It's the most hurtful thing that anybody could ever experience, Beth's daughter Jessica said after her mother's body was located. The discovery of Nita's body came at an already difficult time of year for her family. Her body was located 3 days after the 9th anniversary of the disappearance of her niece, 19-year-old Sage Smith. While Sage's case was initially investigated as a missing persons case, it was reclassified as a homicide investigation in November of 2016. Her case remains unsolved. The same day the 2 bodies were found, 35-year-old Anthony Robinson was arrested for the 2 women's murders. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 2 felony counts of concealing, transporting, or altering a dead body. Robinson was tied to the 2 victims using cell phone records and surveillance footage. He had met both of them on dating sites. Police believe they were both killed at the motel where Robinson was staying. Video surveillance shows him pushing a shopping cart from his room. Police allege that the shopping cart was used to transport his victims' bodies. This method of transporting the bodies would lead to authorities referring to Robinson as the shopping cart killer at a press on December 17th, at which they announced they believe Robinson was a serial killer. Shortly after Nita and Beth's bodies were found, police in Washington, D.C. contacted the Harrisonburg Police Department. They were in the middle of their own missing persons investigation, and Robinson was the last known person to be in contact with the person they were looking for. 29-year-old Cheyenne Brown lived in Washington, D.C. She was a kind soul who was nice, potentially too nice, to everyone she met. She was the loving mother of a 7-year-old son. She was last seen on September 30th, 2021, when she was approximately 4 months pregnant. That day, she was last seen by her family getting on to a local bus. She then took the metro from D.C. to the Huntington station in Fairfax County, Virginia. Surveillance footage shows her with Robinson at the metro station in D.C. Cell phone records show that after taking the metro, Cheyenne was in the 6100 block of nearby Richmond Highway. The Moon Inn Hotel, where staff has confirmed Robinson was staying at the time, is located in that block. Authorities in Fairfax County had searched the area around the hotel previously but had not found any sign of Cheyenne. When they returned to the scene after speaking with authorities about the 2 victims found in Harrisonburg to conduct a larger search, however, a homicide detective noticed a shopping cart in a vacant lot in the vicinity of the hotel. Knowing that Robinson had allegedly used a shopping cart to transport the bodies of the 2 women found in Harrisonburg, the search was focused onto that area. Not far from the shopping cart, authorities found a large plastic container containing 2 sets of human remains. Cheyenne Brown's family positively identified a distinctive tattoo she had on one of the sets of remains, leading authorities to tentatively identify those remains as Cheyenne. "My heart is broken. Just the thought of my baby not being here is devastating. It's like a bad dream I just want to wake up from," Cheyenne's mother, Nakandra Brown, who had called local hospitals and morgues as part of her desperate search for her daughter before her remains were located, told the Washington Post. Cheyenne's family believes that Robinson may have been in contact with her prior to her disappearance. According to Cheyenne's cousin, Jonathan Willis, he went to Nakandra Brown's home in mid to late September while Nakandra was out of the country for work. Cheyenne was there with a man he did not know. He asked the man to leave the home since Nakandra did not like people she had not met being inside her home when she was not there. The man, who Jonathan believes could be Robinson, left without incident. The state of decomposition the other set of remains was found in complicated identifying them, although investigators identified a missing woman from Redding, California, Stephanie Harrison, as a potential match to the remains. 48-year-old Stephanie was last in contact with her family on August 19th while she was on a sightseeing trip in Washington, D.C. Stephanie had 3 children and 3 grandchildren. She normally called her children multiple times throughout the day, so her daughter, Destiny, knew something was wrong when the routine calls from her mother stopped. "My mom was super family-oriented. She was a beautiful, kind soul. She put everyone before herself. She would drop anything she was doing if you called and needed her help. She would give you her last dime if you needed it," Destiny said of her mother. The last transaction on Stephanie's bank records occurred at the Moon Inn Hotel when she checked into a room there. She told her family she knew people in the Washington, D.C. area and may have been communicating with people online. Authorities from Virginia traveled to California to collect DNA samples from Jessica's family members to compare to the remains. On January 7, 2022, authorities announced that DNA had confirmed that the remains found near the hotel belonged to Cheyenne Brown and Stephanie Harrison. Robinson has no known criminal record, although he has interacted with the police in Washington, D.C. before on 3 occasions. In 2012 and 2013, Robinson was involved when police were called for a domestic dispute, unauthorized use of a vehicle, and an argument Robinson had with his aunt. He was not accused of violence during any of these incidents, and they did not result in an arrest or any charges. Police believe Robinson met his victims through various social media and online dating sites, although the only ones they have publicly discussed by name are Tagged and Plenty of Fish. Since his arrest, at least 2 women who met him through such sites have come forward to police. They say that when they met Robinson in person, they could tell that something was wrong and quickly ended their dates with him, which police believe may have saved their lives. Authorities would like to speak with any other women who met Robinson online, particularly through dating sites. Robinson lived a transient lifestyle, moving around and working various jobs. In addition to Virginia and Washington, D.C., he has known former addresses in Maryland and New York. Authorities are investigating possible ties between Robinson and other unsolved cases in various locations. He didn't suddenly turn into who he is 3 months ago. That's why we are painstakingly going through his whereabouts, his relationships, and employment history to figure out if, in fact, there are other victims. The good thing is he's in custody. The challenge that remains is identifying other victims. Fairfax County Police Chief Kevin Davis said after Robinson's arrest, so far, only one other potential victim has been identified. Investigators are currently working to determine if Robinson is connected to the murder of a young woman whose body was found in a shopping cart in Washington, D.C. on September 7, 2021. Her name has not been made public. Digital evidence allegedly places Robinson in the area at the time the victim went missing. While authorities believe it is important to publicize the details of Robinson's crimes in order to identify other potential victims, Robinson's crimes in order to identify other potential victims in other parts of the country, Robinson's lawyer disagrees. In a court filing made in December of 2021, his lawyer asked the court to issue a gag order that would prevent law enforcement from using the term shopping cart killer, releasing information in the case to the public without the permission of the court, or referring to Robinson as a serial killer. He argues that language used by various departments involved in the case is prejudicial and will impact his client's ability to receive a fair trial. He further argues that it is inaccurate to refer to his client as a serial killer, as he has so far only formally been charged with 2 murders. The Fairfax County Police Department issued a statement in response to the filing, standing by their handling of the investigation. The court proceedings are ongoing. 62-year-old Gladys May Hensley lived in an apartment within a senior living complex on High Street in Eugene, Oregon. On June 5, 1986, the staff at the complex became concerned because they had not seen Gladys in a few days and decided to perform a welfare check. When they entered the apartment, they discovered Gladys's body. She had been murdered. The police estimated her time of death as the early morning hours of the previous day, June 4th. One of the apartment's windows was found unlocked, and all of the curtains had been drawn. 2 weeks later, there was another murder in Eugene. While there were differences in victim profile and the location where each victim was found, the Eugene Police Department believed the 2 cases were connected due to the fact that the crime scenes were only a few miles away from each other and the manner of death of each of the victims was the same. That manner of death has not been specified publicly and only described by police as the result of homicidal violence. The second victim was 33-year-old Janice Dickinson. On June 19, 1986, her nude and bloody body was discovered lying face-up under a tree along a hillside behind a car dealership on Colberg Road. She had been assaulted, and there were signs of a struggle at the scene. These 2 murders would later be connected to a case being investigated by the Oregon State Police. 73-year-old Geraldine Spencer Toohey lived alone in her home on Franklin Boulevard in Eugene. On the evening of February 27, 1988, she was speaking on the phone with her sister. The call suddenly cut off in the middle of the conversation. Geraldine's sister went to the home the following morning to pick Geraldine up for church. When she looked inside the house through a window, she saw her sister's half-naked body on the floor inside. Geraldine had been sexually assaulted. Her phone line had been cut, explaining the abrupt end to the call with her sister the night before. Police believed that her killer had known she lived alone and had forced their way in through the front door. A sketch of a potential suspect was developed but did not lead to, and DNA evidence confirmed that all 3 murders had been committed by the same individual. There was no match found to this profile in criminal databases. In 2016, Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs began offering the snapshot phenotyping service, which predicts physical features and generates images of what the contributor of a provided DNA sample might look like. Police in Oregon paid for the service in connection to the 3 women's murders, and 2 images showing what their suspect may have looked like at age 25 and at age 55 were generated. Investigators received the images in September of 2017 and released them to the public in January of 2018 with an appeal for anyone who knew someone who resembled the man pictured in the report to come forward. Unfortunately, despite over 100 tips being called in, the appeal did not lead to an identification. Investigators then worked again with Parban Nanolabs to use genetic genealogy in the case. The effort identified 4 potential suspects for them to follow up on. After extensive further investigation, on February 2, 2022, the Eugene Police Department announced that Gladys, Janice, and Geraldine's killer had been identified as John Charles Bolsinger. In addition to the DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence, footwear analysis, and the development of a timeline of Bolsinger's movements at the time of the murders all supported his identification. Unfortunately, Bolsinger could not be prosecuted for murders because he committed suicide in Springfield, Oregon on March 23, 1988, less than a month after Geraldine Tuohy's murder. Bolsinger was convicted of second-degree murder in Utah for the March 29, 1980 murder of 33-year-old Casey Sorensen, who died, according to Bolsinger's confession, during consensual sexual asphyxiation. He served 5 years in prison and was paroled to Springfield, Oregon on March 7, 1986. Gladys was killed in neighboring Eugene, Oregon just under 3 months later, and Janice was murdered just 2 weeks after that. On September 26, 1986, Bolsinger was arrested after breaking into a woman's home. That night, the woman was having trouble sleeping, and she heard her dog making strange noises in her kitchen. When she got up to investigate, she found a man reaching in through her kitchen window to remove a brace preventing her sliding glass door from being opened. She ran into her living room and called 911. The man made entry into the house and followed her into the living room. When he tried to take the phone from her, she began screaming and hitting him with the phone as well as a nearby flashlight. The man fled the residence, leaving behind a down vest and a paring knife. The woman told the police that the man had run off when they arrived just after he escaped, and he was soon apprehended by a canine officer. The intruder was Bollinger. He said he had gone up to the woman's house and knocked on the door a few times but nothing else, and claimed that he remembered nothing else about the home as he was suffering from memory loss. Bolsinger was sentenced to 5 years in prison but was only in custody in Oregon for less than 1 year. He was transferred from the Oregon Department of Corrections to the Utah State Prison on August 4, 1987, to serve time for violating his parole. He was released from prison in Utah just a few months later on December 7th. He returned to Oregon and enrolled at Lane Community College for the winter 1988 term. Geraldine was murdered in February of 1988. Bolsinger took his own life in March, just a few weeks after the release of the sketch of the suspect in her case, although there is no way of knowing if the sketch influenced his decision. Authorities have not been able to identify any sort of relationship between Bolsinger and any of his 3 victims in Oregon. The press release announcing Bolsinger's identification concluded by saying, "The Eugene Police Department and the Oregon State Police are pleased to finally bring closure to the family members of Gladys, Janice, and Geraldine, as well as our community. Both agencies remain committed to constantly evaluating unsolved cases and utilizing emerging technologies to bring closure to other families of crime victims. This resolution would not have been possible without the dedication of numerous police officers, detectives, crime scene investigators, and crime lab analysts over the last 35 years. This case takes us to Kalamazoo, a city in southern Michigan, specifically to 63100 Proctor Avenue in Comstock Township. This was the home of 22-year-old Christopher Neal, his wife Haley Coe, and their 2-year-old daughter, Charlotte. The couple had recently learned that Haley was pregnant with their second child, and they were thrilled to start sharing the news and expand their family. Everyone who knew Christopher and Haley described them as a perfect match. Both were caring, hardworking, and great listeners, always focused on making others happy. Christopher's father recalled that his son never had trouble walking into a room, even if he didn't know anyone. Within just a few minutes, Christopher would be sharing life stories with someone, showing how much he genuinely cared for others. After graduating from high school in North Texas, Christopher became a volunteer firefighter before joining the Navy. Haley, a young Navy recruit herself, had met Christopher on a beach in Florida. 2 weeks later, he asked her out on a date. Haley politely said, "No thank you," something the couple laughed about for years after. More time passed, and when Haley needed help with her studies for the Navy, Christopher offered to tutor her. They went on their first date shortly after, and Haley said they were inseparable from that point on. The couple soon eloped, and after this, their baby girl Charlotte was born. When Haley found out she was pregnant again, the pair were over the moon and had even started making plans to adopt children after this, providing children in need with a loving home they knew they could give. The couple were often apart due to their time in the Navy, but always made family their priority. Christopher would often write Haley letters and leave messages on her phone while she was sleeping, so that when she unlocked it, she found them later. His friend said he was a hopeless romantic and always let his family know they were on his mind wherever he was in the world. The young couple were often taking photos and sharing them on social media. It really was clear to see just how much they were in love, how much they adored Charlotte, and how precious being together as a family was to them. A year or so later, having finished their duties, they were both granted terminal leave from the U.S. Navy. And in 2019, Chris started a new job in real estate. The family moved to Michigan and started living in Haley's parents' house while they worked on their new dream home, a beautiful home that had actually belonged to Haley's grandmother. Christopher spent most days renovating it, and they couldn't wait to settle in. The family finally moved in on November 17th, and everything seemed to be going great. Christopher was excited about his new job and what this could offer. It was nearly Christmas, and they were finally together as a family with a second baby on the way. With so much joy in the young couple's lives, it's hard to fathom what happened less than 2 weeks later, December 1st, 2019. It was a typical evening in 63100 Proctor Avenue. Everyone had finished their dinner. Charlotte was sound asleep in the other room, and Christopher and Haley settled in for a night of watching television. Suddenly, at 10 p.m., there were several loud bangs on the front door. As most will agree, 10 p.m. is usually quite an alarming time to get a knock at the door unless otherwise expected, so the couple were instantly hesitant. Christopher jumped up to see what was going on. Little did the pair know, a man had opened their screen and interior door and was already inside their home looking around. The man was 35-year-old William Paul Jones, and he was armed with 2 handguns. According to Haley, everything went from 1 to 10 in a matter of seconds. As soon as Christopher saw him, he knew the situation was bad and tried to get his wife and daughter upstairs, moving them around the house trying to get into a room where they could at least lock the door. Christopher then called 911. There was a scuffle between the pair as William tried to get Christopher into another room, which he refused to do. A SWAT team and negotiators had already been dispatched and were starting to gather outside on the street. The operator began explaining to William that she had officers there that were ready and willing to help him, but he needed to put the guns down and let the family go outside. Christopher remained calm and collected, assuring William he understood where he was coming from and trying to calm him down and reassure him. The line was then transferred to the officers and negotiators outside. William answered the phone with a list of demands, one of which was the police were not to enter the house. William then hung up the phone and the officer tried to ring back. Upstairs, panicking and fearful, Haley tried to make a quiet 911 call herself. The situation was escalating and police slowly started entering the house before announcing themselves and continuing the negotiations from the hallway. Neighbors could now hear screaming and shouting and were trying to get hold of police too. Some of the officers who were still outside then called Christopher's phone back, which was answered by William. Although Christopher was still alive at that point, a few moments later shots rang out inside the house and body cam footage captured officers running into the rooms. William jumped out of the bedroom window before officers pinned him down on the front porch. The entire ordeal lasted about 40 minutes in total. As William was taken away, officers found Haley and Charlotte hiding upstairs. "Is my husband alive?" Haley asked. Officers had to deliver the devastating news. 22-year-old Christopher Neal was dead. William had also opened fire as the SWAT team came in, hitting 3 officers as he was trying to escape. Fortunately, the officers survived and made full recoveries. As he had jumped straight through a pane of glass, he was taken into hospital to be checked over. Doctors noted he seemed intoxicated, but he was so resistant it was undetermined what, if anything, was in his system. He wasn't making sense and was rambling about aliens, claiming he didn't know the date, time, or place. It took deputies and hospital security to restrain him as he got more violent and aggressive. Witnesses later told police William often smoked meth before going on long, violent rampages, shooting at cars and breaking into homes. It turned out that William had an extensive criminal record and had spent most of his life going in and out of prison. He had actually been released just 5 days before he killed Christopher. Over the years, he had been arrested and jailed many times for many things, including burglary and home invasion, driving without a license, firearms charges, assault, resisting and obstructing police officers, and fraud, to name a few. When he was calm, William Paul Jones was charged with 19 felony counts, including the murder of Christopher, and his bail was flatly denied. As news began to spread about what had happened, everybody was in a mutual state of shock and disbelief. Neighbors said it was a sobering realization that no matter how safe and quiet their little street and area always felt, this was proof that it simply wasn't. As per Christopher's wishes, there was no funeral held, but friends and family gathered to remember and celebrate his life. His friends remembered him as a goofball, someone that had a thirst for life and a sincere devotion to those he loved. In court, William's obstructive and difficult behavior continued, but his attorney actually advised him to plead not guilty and pushed for a psychiatric evaluation of his client. An extensive evaluation was carried out by the Michigan Center for Forensic Psychiatry, and all everybody could do was wait. It remains unknown as to why all this transpired that night and why William did what he did. He didn't know Christopher and Haley, and there was absolutely no link or motive that anyone could find. It was seemingly completely random. In court, William said he was sorry for what had happened and told jurors it was the worst he had ever felt in his life, but the prosecution weren't buying it. They argued this was completely premeditated and said, if Haley and Chris had 40 minutes to think about whether the defendant will choose for Chris to live or die, the defendant had the same. At any point during that time, he could have stopped what he was doing, but he chose not to, and this was a deliberate and calculated decision. It took jurors just 3 hours to find William Paul Jones guilty of 18 out of the 19 felonies, including 1 count of first-degree murder. In July 2022, the judge said, "There are good people and bad people in the world, and what you did on that day was pure evil," adding there was no reason for him to ever get out of prison. Haley gave a statement and said, "I cried myself to sleep every night for 6 months after Chris died. I'm so broken that living feels like too much. Dealing with the trauma does not make me strong. It reminds me of the card I've been dealt. I can no longer handle simple pleasures such as fireworks on July 4th, or any day for that matter, because as soon as I hear loud bangs, it brings me back to hiding in that upstairs bedroom in my family home, fearing for my life and my family's." She added that William had snatched away all her dreams, one of which was to be old, wrinkly, and cranky in a home together. She said her heart was broken when their daughter Charlotte tearfully told her, "Some days I just want to die already, so I can be with Daddy." The devastation caused by what happened that December night is hard to fathom, and the loss of Christopher has been so widely felt. Haley later gave birth to their son, and he was named after his father. Haley's dad Jack said, "He's the reason my daughter and granddaughter are still here. He sacrificed himself to let his wife and daughter get away. He got them out of the situation, and he's a hero for that. He saved them." Christopher's love for his family and his instincts to protect them at all costs is as admirable as it is utterly heartbreaking. He was a hero until the very end. The Gutierrez family of Lexington County, South Carolina, spent the day of June 5, 1986 doing yard work. After the family ate a dinner of bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches, Deborah Gutierrez painted her 4-year-old daughter Jessica's fingernails. Jessica, who went by the nickname Jessie, asked her mother if she could sleep in her bed that night. Deborah had to tell her no. Jessie had slept in her bed the night before, and Jessie's older brother was suffering from an ear infection. So Deborah wanted to let him sleep in her room instead, so she could keep an eye on him. Jessie therefore slept in the double bed she shared with her older sister, 6-year-old Becky, that night. She went in to go to sleep around midnight on June 6th. When her mother woke up for the day a few hours later, she found her children's room in disarray. Their school papers were scattered across the floor, and the curtains had been pulled from one window. In addition, the front door was open. Deborah realized that Jessie was not in the room with Becky. When she asked Becky where her little sister was, Becky replied, "She's gone. The man with the magic hat and the beard took her last night." In a panic, Deborah tore through the room, looking for Jessie under the bed and in the covers. She tore through the house, looking in every closet and room before going outside to look for her daughter there. She was screaming Jessie's name the entire time. When she came back inside, she asked Becky why she hadn't screamed when the man in the magic hat took Jessie away. The little girl had no answer for her, but she would later say that she had been too afraid to do anything, including go back to sleep, once the man in the magic hat came in her room. The authorities were notified that the little girl was missing, and the search for her quickly began. Suspects were quickly identified but could not be tied to Jessie's abduction. Jessie's mother had kicked her boyfriend out of the home just a few days before Jessie went missing because of his possessive behavior and abuse of alcohol. Deborah was sure he was involved in Jessie's disappearance, but no evidence supporting that theory could be found. Jessie's father was also investigated, but he was living in California at the time and was able to prove that he was still in that state when Jessie went missing. One major piece of evidence was collected at the crime scene. A fingerprint on the window authorities believed the kidnapper used digging entry into the home. It was submitted to the FBI, but no match to the fingerprint was found in any database at the time. Jessie's mother, Deborah, was certain this fingerprint belonged to the man who took her daughter because she cleaned the home's storm door and the windows in her children's room every night with Windex, meaning any prints on those surfaces would have gotten there after she went to bed the night before. A new potential suspect emerged several weeks after Jessie vanished. An acquaintance of her family who was living in the area stole a van and drove it to North Carolina, where he raped a woman. He was subsequently charged with and convicted of this crime. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. At some point during this man's incarceration for this crime, his cellmate claims that he told him that he had abducted and killed a little girl in Lexington County, South Carolina, while wearing a cowboy hat. He allegedly said that Jessie could have been the little girl the inmate had been discussing. They spent weeks searching a landfill near Jessie's home but found nothing. The inmate was questioned and offered to talk in exchange for immunity, but authorities refused to make such a deal. Investigators evaluated the evidence they had against him but ultimately determined they did not have enough evidence to prosecute this individual. A detective told Jessie's mother, Deborah, 2 weeks after the disappearance that statistics showed that Jessie was almost certainly dead. While, over the years, Deborah came to intellectually understand that her daughter was most likely no longer alive, she could never fully give up hope while there was still uncertainty over her fate. While she had to live with not knowing if Jessie was alive or dead, she did know that she would not give up on finding answers. "My baby's lost somewhere in the dark, and I'm not going to stop until I find her," she said in 2017. Jessie's case was reviewed in 2008 and in 2015 when it was transferred to the South Carolina Attorney General's office. In 2021, on the 35th anniversary of Jessie's abduction, a New Age progressed image of her was released to the public. In September of that year, a team from the FBI came to Lexington County to work on the case alongside the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division at the request of Lexington County Sheriff Jay Kuhn. The renewed effort paid off. Just before 8 a.m. on January 6, 2022, 61-year-old Thomas Eric McDowell was taken into custody at his home in Wake Forest, North Carolina. He is being charged with murder, kidnapping, and first-degree burglary in connection with Jessie's case. A district judge in North Carolina ruled he would be held without bond while awaiting extradition to South Carolina. Bond has so far been denied in South Carolina as well now that he has been extradited, although he has so far only had one brief court appearance in that state. While McDowell is being charged with Jessie's murder, authorities have not located her body. Given the ongoing court proceedings against McDowell, authorities have formally only released a limited amount of information about the circumstances that led to his arrest. According to the arrest warrant, admissions to the crime made to others. It is unclear based on his fingerprint being a match to the one found on Jessie's window, a witness identifying him in a photo lineup, and his own admissions to the crime made to others. It is unclear, based on the information in the warrant, when the fingerprint was matched to McDowell, who made the identification, or when the identification occurred. Former County Sheriff James "Jimmy" Metz has confirmed to the State, a newspaper in Columbia, that McDowell is the previously publicly unidentified inmate alleged to have confessed to Jesse's murder. McDowell is a registered sex offender as a result of a March 1987 conviction for an offense which occurred in North Carolina. He also became an acquaintance of the Gutierrez family after his uncle married one of Deborah Gutierrez's cousins. McDowell had provided various alibis to investigators after his cellmate reported his confession, all of which were investigated and disproven. According to Jimmy Metz, he could never secure an arrest warrant for McDowell because prosecutors believed defense attorneys would be able to convince a jury that the fingerprint on the window had an alternative explanation. McDowell had previously done work at the property. Jesse's mother's claim that the window was cleaned daily does seem to be supported by the fact that McDowell's fingerprint appears to be the only fingerprint found on the window. The fingerprint was included as evidence supporting McDowell's arrest in the 2022 warrant. While Mr. Metz is overjoyed that McDowell has finally been arrested, he is also upset and embarrassed by the media coverage and statements from the current investigators that have not disclosed that McDowell had been identified as the prime suspect so soon after Jesse's disappearance. It made us look like we hadn't done our job. We had investigated assiduously, he told the State. According to South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson, without this newly discovered information, our office would not be able to prosecute this case. It is currently unclear what new information allowed for authorities to finally arrest McDowell, and will most likely remain so until further progress is made in the court case against McDowell. Jesse's mother, Deborah, has described McDowell's arrest and the fact that he is being charged with her missing daughter's murder as bittersweet. "I'm glad God brought me to see it," she said after the arrest. "I prayed he would bring me through it, and we waited for this a long time." Deborah spoke at McDowell's first court appearance in South Carolina, asserting how important it was for him to remain in custody due to the threat he poses to the safety of the community. She and Jesse's sister Becky are also using the media attention the arrest has brought to Jesse's case to try to bring awareness to other cases and other families who have suffered as they have. While speaking in court and to the media afterwards, Deborah wore a face mask featuring a photo of Shelton Sanders, who disappeared in 2001. In addition to speaking about Jesse and her case, Deborah and Becky also spoke to the media about how important it is for cold cases, particularly those involving individuals of color, to receive attention from the media and effort from authorities. While McDowell's arrest is a major development in Jesse's case, her mother still has further answers to find, which will hopefully be revealed as the court case progresses. "I intend to find my daughter, and I hope to do just that," she said after McDowell's first court appearance. On November 17, 1978, an individual was out looking for firewood near Lake of the Woods in the Wainema National Forest in southern Oregon. While they were doing so, they came across a gruesome scene approximately half a mile off of Dead Indian Road near Oregon, Route 140. They discovered the badly decomposed body of a young man. Members of the Klamath County Sheriff's Office quickly responded to the scene. The following day, as they continued searching for clues as part of their investigation into the young man's death, they discovered the body of a young woman. Her body had also undergone extensive decomposition. The remains of a small dog were also found. The man and the woman had been haphazardly buried in separate shallow graves. Based on the callous way the bodies had been disposed of, authorities were able to immediately tell that whoever had placed the bodies there had absolutely no respect for the individuals. The male victim's wallet was found amongst his clothes, allowing authorities to quickly identify him as 19-year-old Kirk Leonard Wiseman. The female victim was soon identified as his girlfriend, 17-year-old Cynthia Lynn Freyer. Their autopsy showed that they had both been shot in the head multiple times with a .22 caliber firearm and that Cynthia had been raped. The couple lived in Sepulveda, California, a neighborhood in Los Angeles that has since been renamed North Hills. They had been missing since September. The couple had been in Everett, Washington visiting family along with their brown and white terrier who traveled with them in a carrier. They left Everett on September 23, 1978 to slowly make their way back to California and took a flight from Seattle to Eugene, Oregon. Kirk and Cynthia were known to hitchhike regularly, and witnesses were found to support the theory that they had been hitchhiking around Southern Oregon prior to their murders. After arriving in Eugene on 23rd, they hitchhiked to Roseburg and spent the night in a motel there. A witness came forward reporting that they had then picked the couple up hitchhiking and dropped them off at a restaurant in Grants Pass. The couple had plans to visit Crater Lake at some point during their travels before they returned to California because it was somewhere Cynthia had always wanted to visit. She had traveled in the area with her family the year before, but bad weather had forced them to cancel their plans to visit Crater Lake and made Cynthia even more determined to see it. One of the few items that was discovered along the victims' bodies was a sign that read K Falls. The couple may have used the sign while hitchhiking, looking for a ride to Klamath Falls. Investigators came to believe that the couple had been killed by someone who picked them up hitchhiking either while they were traveling from Ashland to Klamath Falls or while they were traveling back to Ashland after visiting Klamath Falls. They were never able to find evidence confirming that the couple had made it to Klamath Falls. Carl Burkhart was a detective with the Klamath County Sheriff's Office in 1978 and one of the first investigators to respond to the scene when Kirk's body was first discovered. He eventually went on to become the sheriff of Klamath County. He maintained his interest in the case until he retired in 2001. Several other investigators would work on the case for the next 2 decades, with the collective efforts of everyone who worked on the case ultimately leading to it being solved. The evidence from the case was carefully preserved in 1978, meaning that when technology to isolate and process DNA evidence became more commonly used by law enforcement decades later, the evidence was still available for forensic examination. Investigators began looking at the case and exploring the possibility of DNA evidence being found on some of the preserved items in 2011. However, it would not be until 2019 that the crime lab was able to identify DNA on any of the pieces of evidence. DNA from an unknown male was located on pieces of Cynthia's clothing that had been submitted for examination. The items were sent to another lab to confirm the findings of the crime lab. The second lab produced the same results. The DNA profile was run through criminal databases, but no match was found. Authorities then turned to genetic genealogy and worked with Marshall University to prepare a sample to submit to Parabon Nano in Virginia. Parabon used this sample to attempt to identify a suspect based on the amount of DNA the sample had in common with individuals who had submitted their DNA to a genealogy database. They ultimately were able to identify a potential suspect in a report they generated during the summer of 2021. Authorities learned that the potential suspect had died in Texas in 1996, making it more difficult for them to confirm it was his DNA found on Cynthia's clothes. They then turned to the man's ex-wife and children. While they were upset by the idea that he was a murderer, they agreed to cooperate with the investigation, prioritizing Kirk and Cynthia's family's need for answers over their own discomfort. They provided samples of their DNA, which helped confirm that it was the suspect's DNA found on the evidence. They also provided additional information important to the investigation during interviews. They confirmed that the suspect had lived in the Klamath Falls area from 1976 until 1982, during which time he was employed at a local lumber mill. His family was very familiar with the area where Kirk and Cynthia's bodies were found, stating that they had gone camping with the suspect in that area regularly and had routinely driven through the area on the way to visit family friends as well. At a press conference on January 6, 2022, authorities announced that the suspect whose DNA had been found on Cynthia's clothing was Ray Mason Whitson Jr. He did not have a criminal record. According to Klamath County District Attorney Eve Costello, the DNA evidence was strong enough for Whitson to be prosecuted based off of it, had he not died before it was discovered. Detective Dan Towery met with Kirk and Cynthia's loved ones prior to the press conference. Both families requested that he publicly express their gratitude to Whitson's family for their willingness to cooperate with the investigation and bring them answers and some measure of closure, despite the emotional toll doing so took on them. While Whitson cannot be prosecuted or found guilty in a court of law, the investigation is formally being suspended as prosecutors and investigators believe they have identified the only individual responsible for Kirk and Cynthia's murders. With the case formally closed, Several personal items that belonged to the victims that had been held as evidence for more than 4 decades can now be returned to their families. These items include postcards, jewelry, and an unmailed letter addressed to Cynthia's parents, written shortly before Cynthia was killed and found with her body. The letter described how much fun she and Kirk had in Washington state and detailed some of their hopes and plans for the future. The letter will finally be delivered to Cynthia's mother, more than 43 years after Cynthia wrote it. 1985, 63-year-old Helen Brooks lived in a 2-bedroom apartment at the Apple Valley Garden Apartments in Apple Valley, California with her small dog. She had gotten a divorce from her husband, Bill, a few years earlier and was the mother of 2 adult daughters. Helen was a hard worker who had been employed at San Bernardino Valley College in the food services department for 20 years. In 1985, she was working 2 jobs, one as a bookkeeper at the bowling alley across the street from her apartment complex and another as a saleswoman at a fashion boutique called Lolo's inside the nearby Apple Valley Inn. According to the manager of the inn, Helen looked more like 40 rather than 63. This was in part because Helen lived such an active lifestyle and swam in her apartment complex's pool every night. Helen had a very sophisticated and stylish air about her that helped her in her job at Lolo's. She was regularly a model in the annual fashion show the boutique hosted. According to both her neighbors and her co-workers, she was very easy to get along with. She was very well-mannered and never raised her voice at anyone. She lived a quiet life, exercising and sewing in her spare time. On Friday, July 5, 1985, Helen was scheduled to open Lolo's. She did not arrive at work, which was highly unusual. Her boss Dolores was also concerned because she had tried to call Helen all throughout the previous day but never received an answer or a return call. She tried calling a friend of Helen's, and ultimately the sheriff's department was notified. When deputies arrived at Helen's apartment, they found her front door unlocked. Inside, they discovered Helen's body. No one who knew Helen could think of any possible motive for someone to want to kill her. Furthermore, Helen was a very cautious person, especially because she lived alone. She would always lock her door even if she was just stepping away to speak to a neighbor for a moment. She also regularly reminded her neighbors of how important it was to keep their doors locked. Authorities did not immediately release Helen's cause of death, but 2 months later, they did disclose that she had been strangled with a nylon stocking. DNA evidence was recovered from Helen's body, but the exact nature of that evidence has not been disclosed. In the following years, numerous interviews were conducted and several polygraph examinations were administered in connection to Helen's case, but her killer remained unidentified. Cold case detectives looked into the case again in 2009 and submitted evidence for forensic examination in hopes that DNA would be found on it. The effort paid off and a male DNA profile was identified. It was run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system, but no match was found. In 2021, cold case investigators with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department's homicide detail partnered with the FBI's Riverside office and reopened the case. They requested additional analysis of the DNA evidence. Through what they described as additional investigation and advancements in DNA technology, they identified the individual whose DNA was left at Helen's crime scene. On January 24, 2022, almost 37 years after Helen was killed, it was announced that the suspect in Helen's murder was Robert Eugene Wertman. Wertman could not be prosecuted, however, because he had died in prison in 1995. At the time of his death, he was serving a 22-year sentence for a rape he committed in 1990. On Halloween of that year, he met a 49-year-old woman at a bar in Apple Valley. He drove her out to the landfill on Ukaloma Road, where he forced her to undress. He then raped her and forced her to perform oral copulation. He was convicted for this crime in 1991. Wertman was also convicted of rape in Sonoma County in 1978 and had a false imprisonment conviction in San Bernardino County. In August of 1985, just a month after Helen was murdered, he was arrested on suspicion of attempted rape in Victorville, California. Wertman was interviewed in connection to Helen's murder early on in the investigation. He had met her a few days before she was killed. He denied ever being to her apartment or having any part in her murder. While authorities were suspicious of him at the time, They did not have access to the technology that would one day connect him to the crime. While the resolution of Helen's case did not lead to a conviction, it did provide an answer to the decades-old mystery.
My whole family shot me too.
What's the address?
Now.
Okay, listen.
I'm shot right now. My family's dead.
Who did it?
Someone came in. There's someone here with a gun. I don't know if you need to come now.
What you just heard was a desperate call from a 16-year-old boy pleading for his family's lives. Shortly after the call ended, attempts to reach him again were unsuccessful. When the Kitsap rescue team arrived at the scene, they discovered a horrifying and disturbing sight. The house was found burning with 3 bodies, a woman and 2 boys, inside. However, one person was missing, John Derek Kaga, the father. The absence of the father raised immediate suspicion, suggesting he could have been involved in orchestrating this gruesome scene. The Kaga family, consisting of 43-year-old John Derek, Johnny Kaga, 37-year-old Crystal Lynn Kaga, and their 2 16-year-old teenagers, Jonathan Philippe Higgins and Hunter Evan Schaub, lived together in Kitsap County, Washington. John and Crystal had married in 2009, blending their families with the 2 teenagers from previous relationships. Unfortunately, their happiness didn't last long. Their 8 years together as a family were about to come to a tragic end when an unexpected visitor changed everything. January 27, 2017, started out as just another typical Friday in Kitsap County, Washington. As evening came down, the Kaga family gathered in their home on West Tenino Drive, a charming single-story ranch house. Crystal reportedly had some friends over at the residence. Meanwhile, Johnny a phone call while at the house and went out to meet someone, telling the family that he would return home shortly. Johnny later returned to the premises, but did not enter the house. Like any ordinary family, they spent the night snacking, indulging in late-night activities such as scrolling through their phones or watching TV. However, the tranquility of the evening was shattered when on that fateful Friday night, dispatchers at Kitsap County received a harrowing 911 call from 16-year-old Hunter Schaub. In a desperate plea, he urged authorities to rush to their location. By the time the rescue team arrived, a grim scene awaited them at the Kaga residence. The whole family, including Hunter Schaub, had been shot and killed within the confines of their home, which was subsequently set in flames. On Sunday morning, January 29, 2017, the community woke up to a chilling headline. 3 people found dead in Kitsap County home after fire. The news sent shock waves through the area, with residents grappling to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded. The newspapers had this wrong headline, "Homeowner Missing." This added another layer of concern and uncertainty to the already disturbing situation. According to the initial reports, the victims, 2 teenagers and a woman, had been discovered inside a home engulfed in flames. Authorities confirmed that the deaths were classified as homicides, leaving the community reeling from the shock of such a violent and senseless crime. It was confirmed that the crime had taken place the previous Friday night with no sign of the homeowner John. Concerned authorities urged the public to remain vigilant and report any sightings of Kaga or his truck, a brown 2005 Ford F-150. Despite being labeled as a missing person, suspicions began to swirl around John, with some suspecting he may have been involved in the heinous crime. Now the press played a pivotal role in shaping public perception, with headlines fueling speculation and uncertainty. The mention of someone's here with a gun only added to the air of suspicion surrounding Kaga. However, it soon became apparent that the media had made a grave error in reporting the survival of 16-year-old Hunter Schaub, who had made the distressing 911 call before tragically succumbing to his injuries. As authorities continued their investigation, some surprising details emerged, shedding light on the cruelty of the crime. Shell casings, predominantly 9mm, were discovered on the back deck, and more than $50,000 was found in cash hidden in a strongbox in the main bedroom, along with another $7,000 in a money bag. Throughout the next few days, law enforcement spared no effort in their search for Johnny Kaga and his truck, mobilizing every available resource in a desperate bid for clues. Eventually, a crucial development rocked the ongoing investigation: the discovery of John Kariaga's truck. The burnt wreckage containing the lifeless body of Johnny was found on a remote road in North Mason County. The discovery was made by a passerby walking in the area, prompting immediate action from authorities. The announcement from the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office sought assistance from residents in the area, urging anyone with information to come forward. Crime scene investigators carefully searched the area, scouring for clues that might shed light on the circumstances surrounding John's death. Their efforts brought out a crucial piece of evidence: a single latex glove found near the burnt-out truck. Now this discovery raised questions and fueled speculation, prompting authorities to appeal to residents and businesses with security cameras for any footage that might provide valuable insights into the case. Sheriff's Detective Lieutenant Earl Smith emphasized the importance of video evidence, urging those with relevant footage to cooperate with law enforcement. The appeal was met with a swift response from the community, with individuals stepping forward to offer assistance in any way they could. Despite the collaborative spirit permeating the investigation, details surrounding the circumstances of John's death remain shrouded in mystery. According to detectives, the road leading to the tree farm marked by a gate showed signs of forceful entry, with the gate visibly damaged. It appeared as though Johnny's truck had rammed through the gate, which was a stark indication of some level of struggle. Amidst the chaos and uncertainty, the memory of Hunter's shop weighed heavily on the minds of many. Principal Megan Swiecki of North Kitsap High School delivered the somber news, paying tribute to Hunter's memory and urging those who knew him to cherish the moments they shared. As the community mourned the loss of the Kaga family, a sense of hope emerged: the appointment of Detective Elizabeth Lisa Gundrum in this case. With a major lack of definitive evidence and any eyewitnesses, investigators turned to digging into the lives of the victims. As the investigators started to, they uncovered a series of puzzling yet potential motives. These were basically speculations about the family's business ventures and financial dealings, fueling theories of possible illicit activities and criminal connections. The first thing, the disturbing 911 call made by one of the victims, strike the question. Why didn't Hunter mention anything about the fire? Or was he confused? This raised suspicions about the timing and motives behind the arson, adding another layer of complexity to an already confusing investigation. As the investigation progressed, authorities faced a ton of questions and uncertainties. The motive behind the attack, the identity of the person or persons, and the circumstances surrounding John Kariaga's abduction remained shrouded. Amidst the confusion and despair, one question loomed larger than all others. Why? Months passed with little progress. However, in February 2017, a breakthrough occurred when surveillance footage captured John Kariaga at a local grocery store buying cigarettes, seemingly behaving normally in the hours leading up to his disappearance. While this provided some insight into his whereabouts, it failed to yield any significant leads. Then in June 2017, authorities released a photo of a person of interest captured on surveillance footage at a Target store just days before the murders. The image showed an individual entering the store, raising suspicions about their potential involvement in the crime. This marked the first communication from authorities in months, highlighting the urgency of the investigation. Sheriff Gary Simpson emphasized the need for public assistance, confirming that more than one person was involved in the meticulously planned murders. This added a new layer of complexity to the case, prompting hints about the suspect's motives and connections to the victims. The request for information on the unknown suspect, seen at Target 12 days before the murders, raised questions about their possible purchases and their relevance to the crime. Could items bought at the store be linked to the murders, such as firearms or materials found at the crime scene? In September 2017, the investigation progressed with the identification of a person of interest, Danny Kelly Jr. Danny was a longtime friend of Johnny's, even turned out to be Johnny's best man at the time of his wedding. Hunter called it Uncle. I didn't know that. Yeah. Johnny, yeah. Danny Kelly was his best man at his first wedding. Them kids called him Uncle when they were babies. Uncle Danny. Now reports suggested a troubling encounter between Danny and his estranged mother, who accused him of misconduct. The case report was that he had repeatedly groped and propositioned his mother and was arrested on behalf of this case. Besides his alleged involvement in the Kariaga case raised eyebrows, but authorities clarified that he had not been officially charged in connection with the homicides. Now the year of 2017 drew to a close, marking the Kaga family murders as the most significant local news story of the year. The community's deep-seated feelings were further pushed by an anonymous donor who chose to contribute $16,000 to Crime Stoppers, bolstering the reward fund to $20,000. Despite the dropped charges against Danny J. Kelly Jr. for assaulting his mother, investigators remain committed to pursuing leads in the case. On January 11, 2018, authorities released an extended version of Hunter Shop's chilling 911 call as the investigators weren't letting down on the case. They came to notice that Danny was wearing Bandito's motorcycle club attire in the video, and the investigators appealed to members of the motorcycle club for information. Now this marked a significant development as investigators publicly identified Danny Kelly Jr. as a person of interest and highlighted his association with the Banditos Motorcycle Club. For those who aren't aware, the Banditos Motorcycle Club is widely recognized as a motorcycle gang by law enforcement and intelligence agencies across multiple countries. Although the club has denied allegations of being a criminal organization, several members have been convicted of engaging in illegal activities. It has a substantial presence in Washington state and has been the target of various law enforcement operations over the years. According to the Department of Justice, Banditos members have been heavily involved in methamphetamine trafficking and various violent crimes in Washington. Further scrutiny focused on surveillance footage showing Johnny Kaga meeting someone at a local grocery store shortly before the murders. In January of 2020, authorities once again pressed the importance of their belief that members of the Banditos Motorcycle Club were directly involved in the Kaga family murders. They appealed to the biker community for any information that could aid in the investigation. However, since then, there had been little to no progress in the case, and it stayed the same for nearly 5 years. On further digging, detectives found out that Johnny had been involved in the transportation and distribution of for a significant period. He made numerous trips to California, where he reportedly acquired kilos of coke to distribute in Kitsap County. This involvement led him to interact with members of the Banditos Motorcycle Club, particularly Robert James Watson, the leader of the local Banditos chapter, to whom one of Johnny's close associates at the time, Danny, began directly selling the initial suspect, Danny J. Kelly Jr. Despite their close relationship, a falling out occurred before the murders, allegedly over money stolen by Danny. As Johnny went into distribution in Kitsap County, he came into contact with other Banditos Motorcycle Club members who were in process of joining the club. Now the detectives used cell phone tracking to show the locations of Kaga and the Silverdale target, which he used extensively to communicate with John Kaga for the 10 days leading up to the killings. However, communication stopped afterward, even though the phone didn't expire until April 2017. Detectives obtained a search warrant in January 2020 for Robert Watson's cell phone when members of the Banditos were suspected in the homicides. Text messages between Danny and Robert Watson, including one on January 23, 2020, were retrieved, with Danny commenting on the weather saying, "A little fucking humid today." On the night of the murders, the Kaga family had friends over, but Johnny abruptly left after receiving a phone call. Surveillance footage captured him briefly parked next to another vehicle in a nearby grocery store parking lot before driving off. Meanwhile, the friends departed from the Kaga home. Before Johnny could return, 3 men arrived and began shooting. Crystal, Johnny's wife, was reportedly the first victim, followed by her son, Jonathan Higgins, and then Johnny's son, Hunter Shop, who was shot in the driveway. Crystal was shot in the head, and Jonathan Higgins, who came out of his room to check on the commotion, was as well. Hunter's Shop was carrying a pizza into the home when he was ambushed by at least one gunman. It appeared based on the evidence that he surprised the killer. A first shot missed, but he was struck by 2 subsequent shots and Shop was left for dead. But he was still alive when he made the 911 call. The call abruptly ended, suggesting the gunman interfered with or destroyed the phone before fatally shooting Hunter. The assailants then set fires at different ends of the home using fire starter logs and accelerants, and they threw rocks through the windows to fuel the blaze. Now, subsequently, the suspects exhibited suspicious behavior and were linked to the crime through this evidence. Danny was seen by a witness driving Johnny's truck away from the crime scene. Surveillance footage from a local Target showed Danny purchasing a prepaid phone days before the murders, which he reportedly used to communicate extensively with Johnny. Notably, the phone's activity ceased shortly before the killings. Watson visited a club member's house missing his pants and claimed he had fought with a homeless black man. Later that evening, Watson called 911 to report his truck had been broken into several days earlier, and a loaded Glock handgun and a second loaded magazine were stolen. Watson, who worked for Kitsap County Public Works, stopped going to work and was eventually fired in September 2017. Detectives found that about $303,000 was deposited into his accounts that year with numerous cash deposits that couldn't be traced. Johnny Carriaga had reportedly hidden $200,000 under his home, but it was never found. Also, a neighbor heard gunshots on the night of the homicide and saw Carriaga's truck speeding down Tanino Drive. The neighbor identified the driver as Danny, whom he knew from when Danny's family lived in the same house. Following the truck was a silver car, almost bumper to bumper. Detectives noted that Danny and John Carriaga had a strong dislike for each other, making Danny's presence at Carriaga's house or driving his truck suspicious. Less than a week after detectives released video of Carriaga's truck and the unidentified car at the Camp Union Grocery, Robert's brother Johnny Watson's car, a 2006 Mercedes, was found stripped and dumped in the Pouliap River. The vehicle was missing its plates and had not been reported stolen. However, later, Robert and his brother paid $1,500 to retrieve the car. Now there was a question. Why did he only think to report it then, the day after a quadruple murder nearby? Johnny Watson, the third individual, was believed to be the driver of the second vehicle seen in the grocery store parking lot on the night of the murders. And furthermore, the DNA from one of the rocks at the crime scene matched perfectly with his. Finally, on June 6, 2022, a significant development shook the community as 3 men were formally charged in connection with the quadruple murder of the Carriaga family. This marked a crucial moment to the long-standing investigation that had gripped the region for years. The arrest operation, meticulously planned over several weeks, involved approximately 70 police officers spanning multiple counties. The suspects, identified as 43-year-old Danny J. Kelly Jr., 49-year-old Johnny James Watson, and 50-year-old Robert James Watson, were apprehended in different locations across the state. Robert Watson was caught in between traffic at Gig Harbor. Johnny Watson and Danny were arrested about an hour later in their apartments in Bremerton. Following their arrests, the 3 men were booked into local jails and charged with a total of 16 felonies each. These charges ranged from first-degree aggravated murder, first-degree murder, first-degree arson to first-degree burglary. Bail for each defendant was set at a staggering $20 million. The suspects appeared in court the following morning to enter their pleas, with each pleading not guilty to the alleged felony charges. The judge ordered that they be held without bail and imposed strict conditions, prohibiting them from possessing firearms, alcohol, or drugs unless prescribed. Additionally, the defendants were forbidden from having any contact with each other as mandated by the court. In response to the Carriaga family murders, investigators had formed a specialized task force dedicated to unraveling the complexities of the quadruple homicide. This collaborative effort underscored the gravity of the case and the determination of law enforcement to bring the perpetrators to justice. The community awaited further developments in the legal proceedings, hoping that the arrest would mark a significant step towards closure for the families affected by the tragic loss of the Carriaga family. But even in this darkness, there's a glimmer of hope as people come together to remember them. The arrest of the 3 suspects in the Carriaga family murder case was a moment long awaited by those touched by the tragedy. For years, Carly Scott, the mother of Hunter Scott, had pleaded for justice, and finally her prayers were answered. She's made so many emotional pleas over the years, just asking for someone to step forward, and it worked. The detectives got tips from the public that helped crack the case. The suspects, accused of killing an entire family, were brought before a Kitsap County judge, visibly restrained and escorted in the court. Their alleged crimes, fueled by greed, and disrespect, left a deep scar on the community. During the trial, emotions ran high as family members faced the accused, expressing their desire for justice. The suspects exuded an unsettling aura, reflecting on the severity of their actions. Despite the pain and heartache, the arrests provided a sense of relief and closure to the victims' loved ones, and it was very much visible around the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office, as family gathered to hug detectives and each other anxious right after the arrest. As we wrap up today's episode, we invite you to share your thoughts on this disturbing case. Your reflections are valuable to us. On Friday, July 11, 1969, Russell Metcalf had lunch with his best friend, Theodore Ted Conrad, at the Flaming Embers restaurant in Cleveland, Ohio. The two men enjoyed the burgers at the restaurant, which was conveniently close to the banks where they worked. The lunch was uneventful, and they made plans to play golf the following afternoon. However, Ted did not show up for golf the next day, and Russell never saw him again. After lunch, Ted returned to his job at the Society National Bank headquarters in Cleveland's public square carrying a large paper bag. Ted proudly displayed that he had bought a fifth of whiskey and a carton of cigarettes, as it had been his 20th birthday the day before, and he wanted to celebrate over the weekend. No one thought much of it when Ted left the bank at the end of his workday with the same bag. But the following Monday morning, the bank discovered two major problems. Ted, a reliable employee, had not reported for work and could not be reached, and $215,000, equivalent to about $1.7 million today, was missing from the bank's vault. It quickly became apparent that the paper bag Ted carried when leaving the bank contained not just whiskey and cigarettes, but also $150,100 bills, $1,250 bills, and $2,520 bills. By the time the theft was discovered, Ted had already taken full advantage of his 2-day head start, and he was nowhere to be found. Ted had been born in Denver, Colorado, and spent his early years moving across the country, following his father's various postings as a Navy officer. After his parents divorced, Ted chose to live with his mother and older sister. His mother later remarried, giving Ted a stepfather and 2 stepbrothers. Ted met his friend Russell at Lakewood High School, west of Cleveland. Both boys played linebacker for the school football team, but neither of them was talented enough to start for the team. They bonded in part over the fact that they both felt like outsiders because they had both moved to Lakewood partway through high school. Ted had moved there during his sophomore year and Russell during his junior year. In high school, Ted was well-liked but not necessarily popular. He did not have a circle of close friends but was respected enough to get himself elected to the student council during his senior year. He was intelligent with an IQ of 135 and became a member of the National Honor Society. While Ted was well-spoken, he generally kept to himself. His classmates would later describe him as polite and clean-cut, someone who had big plans for an accomplished future. After graduating from Lakewood High in 1967, Ted enrolled at New England College in New Hampshire, where his father was working as an assistant professor of political science following his retirement from the Navy. Ted seemed to do well at the school and was even elected president of the freshman class. However, Ted decided to leave school after just 1 semester. He returned to Ohio and began taking night classes at Cuyahoga Community College. He began his job at the headquarters of the Society National Bank in January of 1969. While it was not clear at the time why Ted left New England College, it would later be theorized that he eventually took the job at the bank specifically for the purpose of pulling off his heist. Ted had been obsessed with the 1968 Steve McQueen movie The Thomas Crown Affair, in which the titular character, a debonair millionaire, orchestrates a complex bank robbery just for the adventure of it and subsequently engages in a game of cat and mouse with a beautiful insurance investigator. Ted saw the film at least half a dozen times. His obsession with the film was not necessarily alarming at first. According to his friend Russell, there were plenty of other young men their age who loved Steve McQueen at the time and aspired to be like him. Seeing McQueen dressed in 3-piece suits and outsmarting the authorities made the character of Thomas Crown seem like someone with an enviable lifestyle. While his manners and intelligence meant that Ted could have arguably been described as a gentleman even at his young age, Ted appears to have begun focusing on the more materialistic idea of what one should be. He convinced his grandmother to lend him money so he could buy a bright red sports car, which he drove while wearing leather driving gloves. He began trying to appear more debonair, showing off his fluency in French, skill at billiards, and love of expensive gin. His fixation with the film may have inspired him to steal from his employer. While he tried to emulate Thomas Crown's high-end lifestyle in the small ways he could, it appears that, like millionaire Thomas Crown, Ted essentially wanted to commit a major theft just for fun and to show off how clever he was rather than for financial gain. Ted had started shoplifting just to prove that he could do so successfully. Ted had called Russell on the evening he stole the money, but Russell was not at home at the time, so Ted was only able to speak to Russell's mother. Russell believes that had he been home that night, his friend would not have had to flee. I still believe had he been able to speak to me or someone else and showed us the money, he would have just put it back on Monday morning, for it was less about the money than proving he could do it, Russell would later say. As it was, Ted never got to tell Russell about the theft. Russell learned about the theft after the bank discovered it on Monday morning. Responding FBI agents called Russell, ordering him to come into the bank where he was employed to tell them everything he knew about his friend. Prior to the theft, Ted had begun telling friends, including some who worked at the bank with him, how easily he could steal from the vault because of the lax security at the bank. Society National Bank did not even fingerprint its employees. He claimed that all he needed to do was find a way to be left in the vault alone. He said he would commit the crime on a Friday because doing so would give him the entire weekend to get out of town before anyone even realized that the money was missing. Ted reportedly called a friend on July 11th to say the day had finally come for him to take the money, but the friend did not believe that Ted was actually going to commit the crime. Ted had decided to go through with the theft on that day in particular because circumstances had aligned to make it possible for him to do so. While Ted had only been employed at the bank for just over 6 months, he was a stellar employee his coworkers believed would rise through the ranks at the bank very quickly. He worked in the bank's vault, packaging and delivering cash to other branches of the bank, a position which the bank only allowed its most trusted employees to fill. On the day of the theft, Ted's supervisor was out of work recovering from surgery. It was against bank policy for any employee to be left alone in the vault, but Ted was essentially left unsupervised that day, meaning he had the opportunity to be alone in the vault. Since Ted was considered to be such an upstanding young man and trustworthy employee, no one at the bank was particularly concerned when he walked into the vault with the large paper bag after his lunch break. Ted was seen by his landlady at 7:26 p.m. outside of his apartment on Clifton Boulevard. He waved her as he was getting into a cab, which took him to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. There, he used a payphone to call his girlfriend Kathleen and tell her that he was going to Erie, Pennsylvania for the weekend to attend a concert. Ted's relationship with Kathleen would allow law enforcement to track Ted's initial movements around the country after he fled with the cash. She received a letter from Ted on July 17th that had been postmarked at Washington's National Airport, and another on July 22nd postmarked in Inglewood, California, near Los Angeles International Airport. Authorities were also able to record a phone call Ted made to her. In the letters to his girlfriend, Ted admitted to stealing the money and ultimately expressed some remorse over his crime. In one of the letters, he indicated that he believed he could return to Ohio and his loved ones after 7 years when the statute of limitations had expired. However, as smart as he was and as clever as he believed himself to be, Ted had misinterpreted the law. Authorities had to charge him within 7 years, and since he was so quickly identified as the perpetrator of the theft, he was indicted within weeks. The clock had stopped on the statute of limitations as soon as he had been indicted for his crimes, meaning he could be arrested no matter how much time passed. On September 12, 1969, Ted Conrad was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of embezzlement and falsifying bank records. A warrant for his arrest was subsequently issued. He faced up to 10 years imprisonment for each of the charges against him. The FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service initially quarreled over jurisdiction in the case, which was one of the largest bank thefts in Cleveland's history. Ultimately, both agencies investigated the case. Authorities followed up on leads across the continental United States, as well as in Hawaii after a couple from Cleveland vacationing there in October of 1969 saw a man they believed resembled Ted. Ted's best friend Russell believed Ted had used the money to go abroad, perhaps to sail around the world. Russell was contacted by investigators periodically as the decades passed. They believed Russell to be the person from his life prior to the theft Ted was most likely to contact. Russell never heard from him. Every few years, authorities would get warrants for the phone records of Ted's loved ones to look for calls they could not account for and could have come from Ted, but they never found any record of him contacting anyone. The letters and calls to his girlfriend just after he left town appear to be the last communications Ted ever had with any of his loved ones. Over the years, Ted was featured in local media and on national programs such as America's Most Wanted. Deputy U.S. Marshal John Elliott remained dedicated to bringing Ted Conrad to justice even as decades passed without him being located. He continued following up on leads, submitting information to international agencies, and collecting evidence that could one day be used to prove that a suspect really was Ted Conrad, should a promising one ever be identified. He was so focused on the case that it became a regular conversation topic with his family. One of the reasons I stayed after this guy is that some people thought he was some kind of hero or Robin Hood. He's not. He's nothing but a thief. A young smart-ass thief who just managed to elude law enforcement for all these years. Hopefully, we can bring him to justice soon, John explained in 2008. Another potential reason for John's fixation with catching Ted Conrad was the multiple small ways their lives had intersected prior to the theft. Like Ted, the Elliott family lived in the suburb of Lakewood. John and Ted went to the same doctor, and Ted briefly worked in a shop where John would take his son to get ice cream. That son was Peter Elliott, who eventually followed in his father's footsteps by joining the U.S. Marshals Service. The elder Elliott retired in 1990 without ever locating and arresting Ted Conrad, but did not lose his interest in the case. He came in to go over his files in the case regularly after his retirement. Ultimately, the role of officially pursuing Conrad would fall to his son, Peter. John Elliott would pass away without ever seeing the resolution to the Conrad case. He and his son, Peter, continued talking about it until the very end of his life. While John was in hospice, his son played an episode of a documentary series for him. The episode focused on the Conrad case, and John had appeared in it. John Elliott passed away in his sleep just a few days later, on March 20th, 2020, at the age of 83. While he spent decades obsessed with the Conrad investigation, his largest professional contribution is arguably the major role he played in Cleveland's mob wars. He helped establish the Witness Protection Program in Northern Ohio in the early 1970s, which proved vital as mob violence escalated in the following years. In the grand scheme of the investigation, John Elliott ultimately just barely missed, living long enough to see the Ted Conrad case finally be closed. Unfortunately, so did Ted Conrad. On November 12, 2021, more than 52 years after Ted Conrad's heist and escape, the U.S. Marshals Service announced that the fugitive had been identified. He had been living outside of Boston since 1970 under the name Thomas Randall. Unfortunately, he could not be arrested as he had died less than 6 months earlier. The major break in the case came when U.S. Marshal Peter Elliott received a tip about an obituary published in the Linfield News, a weekly publication in the suburbs of Boston. He has not publicly disclosed who brought the obituary to his attention. The obituary was for 73-year-old Thomas Randall, who had died of lung cancer in May of 2021. According to Tom's obituary, his life overlapped with Ted Conrad's in very general ways. They had both been born in Denver and had both been born on July 10th, although Tom's birth year was listed as 1947, 2 years before Ted's. They shared some more specific details as well. The obituary listed Tom's alma mater as New England College, the same small school Ted had attended for a semester, and Tom's parents had the same first names, Edward and Ruthabeth, as Ted's parents. Tom and Ted's mothers also had the same maiden name. Knowing that people who create false identities tend to borrow details from the real life they leave behind, Peter began investigating the possibility that Tom Randall was really Ted Conrad. One of the main pieces of evidence that confirmed that Ted Conrad had gone on to live out his life as Tom Randall after stealing from the bank had originally been preserved by Peter's father. John Elliott had been able to track down Ted Conrad's 1967 application to New England College, which contained Ted's signature. In 2021, his son was able to track down the legal papers Tom Randall had filled out when he was filing for bankruptcy in Boston federal court in 2014, which Boston federal court in 2014, which included his signature. Peter was able to submit the documents for analysis, which concluded that they had been signed by the same individual. Based on further document and handwriting comparison, as well as what the U.S. Marshals Service has only described as additional investigative information, they positively identified Thomas Randall as Theodore Conrad. When Peter Elliott and his deputy went to the home where the man known in Massachusetts as Tom Randall had lived since 1986 to inform his widow that the man she had been married to for almost 40 years had not been who she believed him to be, she was not surprised by their arrival or by the news they brought. She admitted that on his deathbed, just before he became too weak to speak, her husband had disclosed to his family that his real name was Theodore Conrad and that he had been living under an assumed name because he was wanted for a bank theft he committed back in 1969. She also said he expressed remorse for his crime, a sentiment which Peter Elliott believes is genuine. No one in the Randall family will face any charges for failing to report this confession. Ted began assuming his new identity in January of 1970 when he went to the Social Security office in Boston to apply for a Social Security number using the name Thomas Randall. His location, like the first name he chose, may have been inspired by the movie that inspired his crime. The Thomas Crown affair had been largely filmed in the Boston area. The Social Security Administration did not begin implementing the enumeration at birth process until the late 1980s, and it was common at the time for individuals to not apply for a Social Security number until they reached adulthood. When he applied for the Social Security number, he provided the same day and month for his birthday, but changed the year of his birth to 1947, 2 years before he was actually born. Once he was able to obtain the Social Security number and card, he was able to construct his new identity around it. He met a woman named Kathy in the early 1970s and married her in 1982. The couple had one daughter and remained married until the man Kathy knew as Tom died in 2021. Ted retained at least 2 of his major interests when he began living as Tom, golf, and luxury vehicles. In the 70s, he divided his time between Massachusetts, Florida, pursuing his passion for golf, playing on the professional winter tour in Florida during the off-season, and working as a club professional at the Pembroke Country Club, south of Boston, the rest of the year. He eventually moved up from giving lessons to becoming the manager at the club. Tom then began a career selling luxury cars, working at various dealerships over the course of 40 years. According to friends of Thomas Randall, his personality was very similar to the one Ted had displayed prior to his fixation with the Thomas Crown affair and the idea of being a high-class criminal. They described him as being the definition of a gentleman with a gentle soul, polite manner, and articulate way of speaking. He was even-tempered and almost never raised his voice. One friend said he probably wouldn't have believed Tom if he had told him the truth about his identity and the stolen money because it seemed so out of line with his personality. The only suspicious detail anyone could identify in retrospect, aside from the fact that Tom always had a beard, was the fact that Tom never mentioned his parents or siblings and only spoke of his early life in very broad terms. While the friends of Thomas Randall, who have spoken to the media, were all shocked to learn that he had deceived them for so long, none of them were particularly upset with their late friend on account of his crime. They largely dismissed the theft as a youthful indiscretion, and the actions of Ted Conrad in his youth did not color their opinion of the more mature Tom Randall, who, as one of them pointed out, did not continue into a life of further crime as far as anyone knows. While Ted, living as Tom, was able to build his life around country clubs and luxury cars, he did so through his employment, not by being wealthy himself. Despite the massive financial head start the money he stole could have given him, he struggled financially. As Thomas Randall, he and his wife filed for bankruptcy in 2014. According to court records, they had over $160,000 in credit card debt. When he died in 2021, the family was still struggling, with unpaid bills continuing to pile up. Authorities are still investigating what happened to the stolen cash. They are currently investigating the possibility that Ted lost it all with a series of bad investments shortly after he stole it. While Tom's loved ones are still struggling to cope with the news of his crime and real identity, Ted's loved ones are relieved to know what happened to him after he fled. Ted's sister was afraid she would die without ever knowing what became of her younger brother, and is relieved to know that he went on to live a happy life. Ted's best friend Russell hopes to one day meet Kathy Randall, so he could tell her stories of what her husband was like when he was younger. Ted Conrad never got the satisfaction he thought pulling off his crime would bring him, and investigators never got to conclude the case with the arrest they spent decades trying to make. While the case never got the dramatic conclusion anyone envisioned, U.S. Marshal Peter Elliott takes some satisfaction in knowing that the efforts his father made in his decades-long investigation ultimately helped identify Conrad. Even though the case was not solved until after his father was gone and Conrad escaped arrest through his death. In the press release announcing that Ted Conrad had been identified, Peter is quoted as saying, "I hope my father is resting a little easier today knowing his investigation and his United States Marshal Service brought this closure to a decades-long mystery. Everything in real life doesn't always end like in the movies." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.